Dr. Kirot Volmak of the Zephyrin Consortium had seen many bizarre forms of life in his decades as a xenobiologist, but nothing could have prepared him for humanity. The humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic community, and their biology was a subject of widespread fascination. They could survive extreme climates, metabolize a dizzying array of substances, and heal from injuries that would kill most other species outright. Their resilience bordered on absurdity, and Kirot had made it his mission to understand why. The assignment to the Joint Human-Zephyrin Research Station in orbit around Kepler 62f had seemed like the perfect opportunity to study them up close. Kirot had been embedded with the station's human crew for 6 months, his days filled with observations, interviews, and occasional incredulous arguments about their baffling habits. On the morning that would change everything, Kirot was in his lab, organizing notes on human circulatory systems. The lab was pristine, with shelves of neatly labeled specimens and equipment calibrated to perfection. The humans, he had noted, seemed content to tolerate a certain degree of disorder in their surroundings, another peculiarity he intended to investigate someday. As Kirot worked, the door hissed open, and a familiar voice broke his concentration. "Morning," Doc said, Eric Mason, the station's chief engineer. Kirot glanced up. Eric was a tall man with broad shoulders and perpetually disheveled brown hair. He had an easygoing demeanor that Kirot found both charming and infuriating. "Good morning, Engineer Mason," Kirot said, his antennae twitching slightly. "You appear disheveled." Eric grinned, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. His face was pale, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Yeah, I'm not feeling great," Eric admitted, leaning against the door frame. "Think I might have caught something." Kirot immediately set down his notes. Illness was not something to be taken lightly. "You are unwell? Have you alerted the medical officer?" Eric waved him off. "Nah, it's just the flu. Happens every year around this time. I'll be fine in a few days." Kirot froze. "The flu? That is a viral infection, is it not? Should you not be in isolation?" "It's not that serious," Eric said, though his voice was hoarser than usual. "I'm just going to take it easy. Rest, hydrate, maybe make some soup later." Kirot blinked, his compound eyes narrowing in confusion. Soup? What possible benefit could soup provide in combating a viral infection? Eric chuckled, though it turned into a cough. "It's just what we do, Doc. Works every time." Kirot stared as Eric shuffled out of the lab, muttering about needing a blanket. This was beyond absurd. On Zephyrin Prime, even the slightest sign of illness was treated with a battery of interventions, antiviral nanobots, targeted immune boosters, and stringent quarantine protocols. The idea of treating a viral infection with soup and blankets was, well, it was ridiculous. But Kirot's curiosity was piqued. He decided to observe Eric's recovery process as a case study, documenting every detail for future analysis. Later that day, Kirot found Eric in the station's common area, bundled in a heavy blanket and sipping from a steaming mug. His nose was red, and his eyes were glassy, but he appeared strangely content. "Engineer Mason," Kirot said, sitting down across from him, "I must protest your lack of medical intervention. This behavior is reckless." Eric smirked. "Relax, Doc. It's just the flu. My immune system will take care of it." "Your immune system?" Kirot asked, incredulous. "You are relying solely on your immune system to combat the virus." "That's how it works," Eric said. "The fever means my body's fighting back. The soup's just for comfort." Kirot's mandibles twitched. "You are allowing your body to increase its core temperature deliberately? Do you not realize the potential for cellular damage?" Eric shrugged. "It's not that high, just enough to make the virus uncomfortable." Kirot stared, his recorder discreetly capturing the conversation. He had read about human fevers in the archives, but seeing it in practice was something else entirely. The Zephyrin immune system was far more precise, deploying nanocytes to target pathogens without triggering widespread inflammation. The idea of raising one's body temperature to fight an infection seemed barbaric, and yet, here Eric was, alive and coherent, despite his alarming symptoms. Over the next 2 days, Kirot monitored Eric closely, checking his temperature, tracking his hydration levels, and analyzing samples of his blood. Despite Kirot's dire predictions, Eric's condition gradually improved. By the third day, his fever had broken, and he was back to his usual self, joking about how he had beaten the flu without breaking a sweat. Kirot's recorder was filled with notes, but they only raised more questions. How could such a rudimentary approach to illness be effective? Was it a quirk of human biology, or was there something more at play? As Kirot compiled his data, Eric joined him in the lab, holding 2 mugs of what he called chicken noodle soup. Figured you could use a break, Eric said, setting 1 mug down in front of Kirot. Kirot regarded the steaming liquid with suspicion. What precisely is this? Soup, Eric said with a grin. It's good for the soul. Kirot doubted that claim but took a cautious sip. The soup was salty and warm, with soft chunks of what Kirot assumed were vegetables and protein. It was surprisingly pleasant. As Eric leaned back in his chair, sipping his own soup, Kirot couldn't help but ask, why do humans insist on such primitive methods? Surely there are more advanced treatments available. Eric shrugged. Probably, but this works for us. Sometimes, simple is better. Kirot mulled over the words, his antennae twitching thoughtfully. Perhaps there was something to be learned from humanity's unconventional approach. Kirot wasn't sure why he kept returning to Eric's side. Perhaps it was the scientist in him, compelled to uncover every nuance of this bizarre recovery process. Or perhaps it was something else, a growing fascination with the way humans seem to embrace their vulnerabilities as if they were a natural part of life, rather than a flaw to be eradicated. The following day, Eric's symptoms returned with a vengeance. His voice was nearly gone, his coughs rattled the walls of the station, and he looked like he had been dragged through a meteor storm. Yet there he was in the common area again, bundled in the same patchy blanket, surrounded by a small mountain of tissues. Morning, Doc, Eric croaked as Kirot entered. Engineer Mason, Kirot said, his antennae stiff with concern. Your condition has worsened. You must allow me to administer antiviral treatment. Eric waved a hand dismissively, his blanket slipping slightly. Nah, I'll be fine. Just a bad day. Happens sometimes with the flu. Body's still fighting. Kirot sat down beside him, his compound eyes narrowing. Your insistence on allowing this virus to run its course is highly irresponsible. What if your immune system fails to eliminate the pathogen? It won't, Eric said with a grin that quickly turned into a coughing fit. Once he regained his breath, he added, I trust my body. It knows what it's doing. Kirot couldn't decide if this blind faith in his own biology was admirable or insane. On Zephyrin Prime, no one would dream of leaving their health to chance. But Eric's confidence seemed unshakable, even as his condition visibly deteriorated. Perhaps you should at least remain in isolation, Kirot suggested, to prevent the spread of the virus. Eric shook his head. Don't worry. Everyone else got their flu shots. Flu shots, Kirot asked, the unfamiliar term catching his attention. Yeah, Eric said. Vaccines. Tiny doses of the virus to train our immune systems. Most of the crew's already immune to this strain, so I'm the unlucky one who caught it. Kirot's mandibles clicked as he processed this information. He had read about human vaccination practices but had not encountered them in practice. The idea of deliberately introducing a pathogen into the body to build resistance seemed risky, yet it was evidently effective. For the next several hours, Kirot hovered nearby as Eric alternated between sipping soup and dozing under his blanket. The common area, usually bustling with activity, felt strangely quiet as Eric's labored breathing filled the space. Kirot busied himself with his recorder, documenting every detail. Day 3 of observation, Kirot muttered into the device. Subject continues to exhibit symptoms consistent with influenza, including elevated body temperature, persistent cough, and general lethargy. Despite the absence of medical intervention, the subject remains confident in his recovery. Further data collection required to determine the validity of this approach. As the hours dragged on, Eric's fever climbed higher. Kirot could see the strain on his face, the way his hands trembled as he reached for his mug. It was almost too much for Kirot to bear. Engineer Mason, he said firmly, this has gone far enough. Your body is clearly struggling to manage the infection. If you do not accept treatment, you may suffer long-term damage or worse. Eric cracked one eye open and managed a weak smile. Doc, I appreciate the concern, but you've got to trust the process. My body's doing exactly what it's supposed to. Supposed to, Kirot repeated, incredulous. You are risking your life based on a hypothesis. Not a hypothesis, Eric rasped. Experience. Humans have been dealing with the flu for centuries. We know how to handle it. Kirot's mandibles clicked in frustration, but he forced himself to remain calm. Eric's condition was alarming, yes, but there was something undeniably compelling about his determination to see this through. By the evening, Eric's fever had reached what Kirot deemed a critical threshold. He finally convinced Eric to allow him to perform a full diagnostic scan, which revealed that the human's immune system was indeed in overdrive. White blood cells swarmed like an army, targeting the virus with an efficiency that Kirot couldn't help but admire. It is remarkable, Kirot admitted as he reviewed the data. Your immune system is expending a tremendous amount of energy to combat the pathogen. I am surprised you have not collapsed from exhaustion. Thanks, I guess, Eric said, his voice barely audible. Kirot hesitated. You require sustenance to maintain this level of activity. I will retrieve more. Soup. Eric chuckled weakly. See? You're starting to get it. Kirot returned with another steaming bowl, carefully placing it on the table in front of Eric. The human accepted it with a nod of gratitude, his hands trembling as he lifted the spoon to his mouth. Why soup? Kirot asked after a moment. Eric shrugged. It's easy to digest, keeps you hydrated, and feels nice when your throat's sore. Plus, it's comforting. Comfort, Kirot repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word. It wasn't a concept he often considered in his work, but it seemed to hold great significance for humans. As Eric sipped his soup, Kirot observed in silence. For all his frustration and confusion, he couldn't deny the results. Eric's body, though battered, was fighting valiantly, and perhaps, just perhaps, there was some merit to this strange combination of rest, soup, and blankets. By the time Eric finally fell asleep, Kirot felt a strange sense of respect for his human subject. Eric's methods might be unorthodox, even reckless, but they were undeniably effective. Kirot adjusted the blanket around Eric's shoulders, his antennae twitching thoughtfully. There was still so much to learn about humans, but one thing was clear: they were a species unlike any other. By the next morning, Eric's fever showed no sign of abating. Kirot, who had stayed nearby through the night, was beginning to doubt the human's confidence in his so-called process. Eric awoke with a groan, his voice a rasping shadow of its former self. His eyes were bloodshot and his movements sluggish. Good morning, Kirot said, though there was no optimism in his tone. Your condition has not improved. I insist you allow me to administer treatment. Eric shook his head, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. It's a flu, Doc. I just need a little more time. Time may not be on your side, Kirot said, his antennae twitching in frustration. Your immune system is clearly overtaxed. At this rate, you risk severe dehydration, organ stress, or worse. Eric gave him a tired smile. You worry too much. Kirot stared, his compound eyes narrowing. And you worry too little. Reluctantly, Eric agreed to let Kirot conduct another diagnostic scan. The results were similar to the previous day, but Kirot noticed subtle signs of improvement. Inflammation markers were stabilizing, and Eric's immune response, though still aggressive, appeared to be gaining the upper hand. Still, Kirot couldn't shake his unease. Your body shows signs of progress, he admitted, but the strain on your system is unsustainable. You must consume more nutrients and fluids. Eric laughed weakly, coughing into the crook of his arm. Fine, fine, I'll make some more soup. No, Kirot said firmly. You will remain here. I will retrieve the soup. The kitchen was a new frontier for Kirot. He had observed humans preparing food before, but he had never attempted it himself. Fortunately, Eric's collection of instant soup packets provided a straightforward solution. Kirot followed the instructions meticulously, boiling water and stirring the dehydrated contents until they resembled the substance Eric called chicken noodle soup. When Kirot returned, Eric was dozing in the common area, his head lolling to one side. Kirot set the bowl down gently, the warm aroma wafting up as he nudged Eric awake. "Eat," Kirot instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Eric blinked blearily but obeyed, lifting the spoon with trembling hands. He managed a few sips before pausing to grin at Kirot. "Not bad, Doc. You might have a future in catering." Kirot ignored the comment, focusing instead on Eric's vitals. His fever remained high, but his pulse and respiration were stable. It was a paradox. Eric's condition seemed both dire and under control. As Eric continued to eat, Kirot retrieved his recorder. Day 4 of observation. Subject's symptoms persist, though some physiological markers indicate early signs of recovery. The continued reliance on rudimentary treatment methods, primarily rest, hydration, and soup, remains baffling. Further investigation required. Eric chuckled softly. "You're really fascinated by this, aren't you?" Kirot looked up, his antennae twitching. "Your methods are unconventional. They defy all principles of modern medicine." "They work," though, Eric said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Sometimes you don't need fancy tech. Sometimes you just need the basics." Kirot wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny the results. For all his skepticism, Eric was improving. Slowly, yes, but undeniably. As the day wore on, Eric's energy began to return. He even managed a brief walk around the station, though Kirot insisted on accompanying him to ensure he didn't overexert himself. "You're like a mother hen," Eric teased as they strolled through the empty corridors. "I failed to see the humor in your situation," Kirot replied, his tone clipped. "Relax, Doc. I'm getting better. You'll see." Kirot wasn't so sure, but he had to admit Eric's resilience was remarkable. By the evening, Eric's appetite had returned, and he polished off a second bowl of soup with surprising vigor. "You seem pleased with yourself," Kirot observed. "Of course," Eric said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "Told you I'd beat this." Kirot didn't respond, but his antennae twitched thoughtfully. The human's confidence was contagious, even if it was wholly irrational. That night, Kirot stayed in the common area, keeping a watchful eye on Eric as he slept. The human's breathing was steady, his fever finally beginning to subside. For the first time since the ordeal began, Kirot allowed himself a small measure of hope. As he recorded his observations, Kirot found himself reflecting on the broader implications of Eric's recovery. What if humanity's approach wasn't merely a product of ignorance or stubbornness? What if it was an adaptation, a way of life that prioritized simplicity and self-reliance over technological dependence? The thought intrigued him. Perhaps there was more to learn from humanity than he had initially assumed. The 5th day began quietly, with Eric stirring awake from what appeared to be his first peaceful sleep in days. Kirot, who had been reviewing his recordings, immediately noticed the change. Eric's complexion was less pallid, his breathing more even, and his movements lacked the sluggishness that had characterized his recent state. "Morning, Doc," Eric said, his voice still rough but steadier than before. "Your condition has improved significantly," Kirot noted, his antennae twitching with relief. "It appears your immune system has successfully neutralized the pathogen." "Told you it would," Eric said with a grin. "Just needed a little time, some soup, and a whole lot of sleep." Kirot couldn't suppress a low clicking sound of disbelief. "This entire ordeal has been a case study in biological chaos. Your body endured a fever that should have caused severe complications, yet you appear unharmed." "Well, not entirely unharmed," Eric said, stretching with a wince. "Pretty sure I lost a few pounds sweating through that fever. But hey, I'm still standing." The casual tone grated on Kirot's nerves. "Engineer Mason, your recovery is nothing short of miraculous. Yet you continue to treat this matter as though it were inconsequential." "Because it is," Eric replied. "Humans get the flu all the time. It sucks, but we bounce back." Kirot clicked his mandibles in frustration. "You trivialize an event that could have been fatal without proper intervention. This behavior is reckless, even for a human." Eric shrugged. Reckless or not, it works. Besides, I wasn't alone. You were here, keeping an eye on me. The comment caught Kirot off guard. He hadn't considered his role in Eric's recovery as anything more than clinical observation, but perhaps there was some truth to the human's words. As Eric slowly regained his strength, Kirot found himself reflecting on the events of the past week. The experience had been both frustrating and enlightening, challenging his assumptions about medicine, biology, and resilience. Eric's recovery wasn't just a testament to the human immune system, it was a glimpse into the philosophy that seemed to guide the species as a whole. On the 6th day, Eric returned to his duties, though Kirot insisted on accompanying him to ensure he didn't overdo it. The station had remained largely stable during Eric's illness, but minor repairs and adjustments were always needed. As they worked side by side in the maintenance bay, Kirot couldn't help but ask, "Do all humans approach illness with such nonchalance? Or are you an outlier?" Eric laughed, the sound echoing in the metallic space. "Most of us do, yeah. We've been dealing with stuff like this for so long, it's just part of life. You get sick, you rest, you get better." "And when you do not get better," Kirot pressed. "Then we try something else," Eric said. "Doctors, medicine, fancy tech, whatever it takes. But most of the time we don't need all that. Our bodies know what to do, and we trust them to do it." Kirot considered this as he adjusted a calibration tool. The idea of trusting one's body to handle a life-threatening situation seemed absurd. Yet it had worked for Eric. Later that evening, the two of them sat in the common area, sharing a meal that Eric had insisted on preparing himself. The soup was heartier this time, with chunks of meat and vegetables floating in a rich, fragrant broth. Kirot found the flavor surprisingly enjoyable, though he suspected it was more due to the satisfaction of shared effort than the soup itself. "You know," Eric said between bites, "you've been a pretty good sport through all this. I think I might have driven you a little crazy with my primitive methods." "That is an understatement," Kirot replied dryly. "Your refusal to accept advanced treatment was both maddening and inexplicable." Eric grinned. "But you learned something, right?" Kirot tilted his head. "I have learned that humans are an enigma. Your biology defies conventional understanding, and your approach to illness is unorthodox, to say the least." "Take that as a compliment," Eric said. "We're full of surprises." Kirot couldn't argue with that. The humans were, without a doubt, the most perplexing species he had ever encountered, but they were also fascinating, resourceful, and undeniably resilient. As Eric cleared the dishes, Kirot activated his recorder one last time. Final observation: Subject Mason has fully recovered from the influenza virus without the aid of advanced medical interventions. Recovery was achieved through a combination of rest, hydration, and the consumption of nutrient-rich liquids. While this approach is inefficient by Zephyrin standards, it proved effective for the subject in question. Additional studies are recommended to better understand the unique characteristics of human physiology and their implications for broader galactic medicine. Eric returned to the table, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're going to write a whole report on this, aren't you?" "Of course," Kirot said. "Your recovery raises important questions about the role of simplicity in medical care. It may even prompt a reevaluation of certain Zephyrin practices." "Glad I could help," Eric said with a wink. As the two of them sat in companionable silence, Kirot found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: respect. Humans might be chaotic, unpredictable, and maddeningly stubborn, but they were also remarkable in their ability to endure and adapt. And though Kirot would never admit it, he had grown to admire them.